بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Welcome back everyone to a brand new course in logic. This course, if you've taken the inheritance course before, it will be a little bit similar in the sense that I have my laptop in front of me and I have translated, alhamdulillah, the text in a previous life. I've translated the text, alhamdulillah, into English. So we're going to read the Sulam in Mantiq, and it's a versification of an earlier text known as the Isaguji. While the Isaguji has been translated into English, we actually have a translation of that here. Unfortunately, I'm more familiar with the versification because that's the one I studied, and I even have from my days as a student at Azhar, I have my little text. That's what I'm used to teaching. So I'm going to go, line by line, and I'm going to be correcting the translation for you, and then I'll upload it when it's done, so you'll have that in your student portal. It's also similar to the inheritance class in the sense that I might finish the text before all of the 15 lectures, so there will be some fillers. And I'm still debating as I'm recording this now how I'm going to do the fillers. But what I'm going to do in today's class is I'm going to introduce to you the subject of logic, where it comes from in the Islamic world. And actually, this sister, Ferial Salim, who translated the Isaghoj into English, she has an excellent introduction. And I'm actually just going to read you the introduction. Pretty much this entire lecture will be me reading this and commenting for you. I also have the original category or organon, of Aristotle in the collected works of Aristotle. I just want to show you that so you can see how sophisticated it is. If we are able to enter into like the first lines of the poem, we will. But I want this lecture to serve for you as a reference, as an introduction, so you can understand where logic comes from, how it is based on Aristotelian logic but slightly different than Aristotelian logic, how it does not represent all of Aristotelian logic, how there were kind of efforts inside Islam to synthesize this information and to make it cogent for the student of Islamic knowledge. And then after that, we can actually get into the topic. So that's what this lecture is. This is going to be like an introduction where I'm largely going to read from this introduction to introduce to you. I said introduction 3 times, but I think you get the point. To introduce you to the concept of mantiq, logic. We'll begin in the next clip, inshallah. All right, let's begin. So this is an excellent resource which is called The Complete Works of Aristotle, edited by Jonathan Barnes, the Revised Oxford Translation. This is in two volumes, 2 massive volumes like this. And this is volume 1. You don't have to have this for the class, but since I have it, I just grabbed it off the shelf. And I wanted to show you that this is the organon of Aristotle, made up of the categories di interpretatione, prior analytics, posterior analytics, topics, and sophistical refutations. So in this printed copy, this goes all the way from page 3 to page 314. So this is the organon. This is the logic that was established by Aristotle. In later years, as you will read in the introduction, there was an introduction by another European scholar named Porphyry, who wrote the Isagoj, which means muqaddima, means translation, which is obviously much thinner. And let me just show you kind of the Isagoj that we have. It's just a small little text, and this is Arabic and English, so it will be half of these pages. And there is debates whether the Isagoj was part of Aristotle's logic or an introduction to Aristotle's logic. There are differences of opinion. And then Athir ad-Din al-Abhari, rahimahullah, is the one that wrote this Isagoji, which is an introduction to the categories of Aristotle, but done from our perspective. So some people would falsely claim that this is a translation of Porphyry's introduction, but it's not. And while the while the organon of Aristotle was translated in its entirety into Arabic, and you'll find people like Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi, rahimahumullah, the Muslim philosophers talk about those kind of things. For the average Sharia Sunni Sharia student, well, I guess in Shia Sharia student as well, even though they delve more into Farabi and Ibn Sina. But for the average Sharia student, we suffice with this kind of introductory text. And this text, the Isaroj of Al Athir, was versified, made into a poem, which is the text that we're actually going to study in this class. I know that it sounds like I'm rambling, but my point is just to give you a little bit of these names and backgrounds. And because I found Sister Feriel's, introduction actually really, really useful, I just thought if it's okay with all of you guys, maybe we'll just read it and I can comment on it as we go along. It's not a very long introduction. 17, it's about 10 pages. So this is her translation to Mantiq, and she begins and she says, may Allah bless her for her efforts. I've never met her, but this is great. I'm glad that she did this. What is logic and why study it? The word logic is derived from the Greek word logos, meaning reason or word. In Arabic, logic is translated as mantiq, derived from the trilateral root nun, ta, qaf, nataqa, which also is nataqa is to speak, which means to speak. The field of logic presupposes that the foundation of speaking clearly and articulating one's claims persuasively requires an understanding of how to make sound arguments. So, as you will see in the text, logic to thinking is like grammar is to speech. So, you don't say قال الله, you say قال الله because Allah is the fa'il and it's marfu'a. This is basic Arabic grammar, so you have to sound correct. Just like when you read the Quran, you have to read it right. Mantiq does the same thing, so you think correctly. That's the idea. In the context of Islamic studies, the study of logic is essential for a sophisticated understanding of theology, kalam, methodology of jurisprudence, usul al-fiqh, which are the two main subjects that you'll find mantiq in. As a matter of fact, in Al-Ghazali's Mustasfa, one of the great books of usul al-fiqh, he has an introduction to the whole usul al-fiqh on mantiq, and he says that this is the usul of everything. This is the basis of thinking of everything that you must know to be able to think correctly. Many of the arguments for the existence of God, theodicy, and discussions regarding divine attributes would be unintelligible without a basic ability to think clearly. Similarly, the format of Islamic legal methodology relies heavily on the reasoning skills and methods established in the study of logic. The goal of logic is to analyze the way in which knowledge is introduced into our minds. How can we describe the type of knowledge that is based on self-evident axiomatic information? How can axiomatic concepts, tasawwurat, how you conceptualize something in your mind? I mean, I will translate these terms slightly different, but I'm just reading the translation. How can axiomatic concepts, tasawwurat, be categorized into groups? How can we perceive objects as distinct entities? When arriving at knowledge through a process of reasoning, how do we use axiomatic concepts as building blocks to make connections that result in what we call syllogisms, which is a major part of mantiq? What kind of information do syllogisms lead to, and what makes them valid or invalid? The study of logic involves all these questions, the foundations of which Al-Abhari covers in his Isaroj, the text that we're basically going to study. Thus, we use logic to analyze how we know what we think we know in order to avoid flawed reasoning that may lead to faulty or invalid conclusions. This is especially relevant to specialists of Islamic sciences because many materials in classical texts, especially texts of theology and fiqh, use logical reasoning to derive conclusions. Logic was considered both a tool which to understand and analyze Islamic texts and an art form that disciplines the mind through balanced thinking. It is for this reason that many Islamic texts on logic have titles that include names such as balance, mizan, Ghazali uses that, an art, al-fan, fannul mantiq, measurement, ma'yar. Examples of the phrases used in philosophical texts includes ilmul mizan, the science of balance, fannul mizan, the art of balance, lisanul mizan, the language of balance, mizanul uqul, balance of minds, ma'yar al-ilm, the measurement of knowledge, or al-qistas al-mustaqim, the just balance. Al-qistas al-mustaqim, that is the name of one of Al-Ghazali's books on logic. Indeed, it is also for this reason that the study of logic has been historically an integral element of the curriculum of Islamic education networks throughout the pre-modern Muslim world, and it's why we teach it at the university. Okay, let's talk about Athir ad-Din al-Abhari's life, his teachers and his works, rahimahullah, who wrote the Isaruj, the main text of Mantiq in Islam, of which we are reading basically the versification of. Al-Abhari, rahimahullah, was one of the earliest students of Fakhr ad-Din al-Razi. He played a significant role in establishing al-Razi's model of argumentation, philosophy, and theology. Al-Abhari's most famed work, Risalat al-Athariya, known as the Isaruj, and Hidayat al-Hikmah, established his renown and were used for generations in educational networks throughout the Muslim world, from the Western Islamic lands to the Indian subcontinent. There are a variety of references to the birthplace of Athar ad-Din al-Mufaddal ibn Umar al-Samarqandi al-Abhari, who died in the year 663 of the Hijrah. It is said that al-Abhari began his studies in Mosul, then moved to Khurasan and Baghdad. In addition to being a student of al-Razi, he was also a contemporary of Nasr ad-Din at-Tusi, who died in 672. Many later commentaries were written on al-Abhari's Isaruj. I mean, there's so many of these commentaries. I have a shelf just full of at least a dozen these little commentaries on that text. Amongst the most well-known commentaries are the Fawaid al-Fanariya, written by Mullah Fanari, who died in 834, the first Sheikh al-Islam of the Ottoman Empire, and Matla' Sharh al-Isaruji of the renowned Shafi'i and Egyptian scholars Sheikh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari, which just came out in a critical edition. I was debating teaching that, but I figured since I already translated the verse, it would just be easy for me to just do that. The Isaruj was versified, that's what we're going to study, by Abdurrahman al-Akhdari, who died in 983, in his Sulam al-Munawraq fil Mantiq. That's the text that we're actually going to read together, which is the verse form of the Isaruj that the introduction I'm reading from, which became a prevalent source in North Africa and Maliki context, because al-Akhdari is a famous Maliki jurist and he has other poems in the Maliki madhab. Al-Abhari's Isaruj was first translated into Latin in 1625 by P. Thomas Novariensis. Edwin Calvary later published an English translation of the Isaruj in the Duncan Black MacDonald Memorial volume published in 1933, which I have not consulted, unfortunately. Other works composed by Al-Abhari include Tanzil well, I don't have to read those books. In addition to these works, Al-Abhari also wrote a number of books on astronomy and geometry. Most of his works have not been published and are only available in manuscript forms in the libraries. And we'll pick up in the next clip, in which we'll talk about a brief history of logic. Okay, a brief history of logic. Aristotle's work, known as the Organon, which I showed you from the original or the English translation, were given much attention for their use as a quote-unquote tool or instrument for acquiring knowledge. The word organon means tool in Greek. The 6 books in Aristotelian logic, which are the ones I read for you, but one of them is in Latin, I kind of butchered it, so let me read them for you again here, are number 1, the categories. The categories for us are those 10 categories that we summarize in this well-known poem, teaching poem, زيد الطويل الأزرق ابن مالكي كان في بيته بالأمس متكي بيده غصن فلاواها فالتوى تلك 10 مقولات سوى. Zayd, the tall, blue man, son of Malik, was in his house yesterday, leaning against a wall. In his hand was a stick. He bent it, and it bent. These are the 10 categories of the essence, and then possession, weight, color, etc. It's just in a rhyming format. So the categories is the first book. Number 2 is interpretation. Number 3 is prior analytics. 4 is posterior analytics. 5 is topics, and 6 is on sophistical refutation. Later commentaries in Western tradition consider other books added that Aristotle wrote, the rhetoric and poetics. And number 9, Porphyry's Isaruj, to be part of the Organon. She'll talk about Porphyry momentarily. While modern histories on the spread of the evolution of ancient philosophy tend to center on modern-day Europe as the region in which philosophy emerged and evolved, a far more comprehensive history of philosophy emerging from the ancient Greece reveals that in fact regions east of modern-day Greece, places such as Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. If I'm not mistaken, Proferi was from Turkey, modern-day Turkey. Jundi Shapur near Baghdad, parts of the Syrian coast, and Alexandria, the original Alexandria in Egypt, adopted the ideas of Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato, and Plotinus before they became prevalent in Europe. When Muslims settled in these regions and or when individuals from these lands converted to Islam, the cultural practices and intellectual trends of these regions merged into cosmopolitanism of Muslim lands that hosted a variety of faiths and schools of thought under the umbrella of Islamic civilization. Thus, what began as Greek philosophy under the pagan Greeks were studied by Greek-speaking Middle Eastern Christians who were later the mediums through which Muslim philosophers acquired these texts. And if I'm not mistaken, it was Ibn al-Muqaffa, the famous Abbasid man of letters, who was himself a convert. I think he was a Zoroastrian convert, but I could be wrong. He translated the entire Organon. So this is the Abbas is early on. So you're talking within the first few hundred years of Islam, the entire Organon of Aristotle was translated. As a result of this eastward spread, Al-Muqaffa also translated Al-Kalila wa-Dimna, which is a famous Hindic book of fables. He translated that. As a result of this eastward spread, regions like Baghdad and Samarkand became new centers for the study of ancient philosophy. Here, Muslim attitudes towards Greek philosophy were diverse and a variety of beliefs were tolerated and openly debated. Greek philosophical texts were first translated into Arabic by Arab Christians in Syria and Iraq who were trained in the Greek and Syriac used in biblical text. The Abbasid rulers, this is where I just mentioned Al-Muqaffa, the Abbasid rulers were great patrons of philosophers. Under the Caliph Al-Ma'mun, rahimahullah, a movement to translate philosophical texts into Arabic in a systematic fashion emerged in an academy known as Baytul Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. As philosophy became rooted in Arabic amongst Muslim thinkers, later Muslim philosophers did not simply preserve Greek philosophical texts in Arabic. Rather, they engaged with them and produced literature to substantially develop these ideas further. And that's an important thing. This is not just a translation. This is our synthesis of Aristotelian logic. Ancient philosophy and Islamic thought merged to form a distinctly Islamic philosophical system that enriched the wisdom it inherited. Muslim philosophers debated, critiqued, and developed the ideas they encountered in an attempt to reconcile ancient philosophy with Islamic monotheism. In the earliest phases of the development of philosophy in the Muslim world, Al-Kindi, rahimahullah, died in 259, very early on, formed an essential bridge through which the works of Plotinus were transmitted into Arabic philosophical writings. Almost 1 century later, Al-Farabi, rahimahullah, who died in 339, expanded on the works of Aristotle. He organized the books of the Organon according to the following schema: Al-Madkhal, the Isaguj; Al-Maqulat, the categories; Al-Ibara, on interpretation; number 4, Al-Qiyas, prior analytics; number 5, Al-Burhan, posterior analytics; number 6, Al-Jadal, topics; number 7, Kitab al-Hikmah, on sophisticated refutations; number 8, Al-Khitaba, rhetoric; and number 9, Al-Shi'r, poetics. Ibn Sina, rahimahullah, who died in 428, known in the West as Avicenna, was the unprecedented genius of the Greek philosophical tradition. His contribution permanently reshaped philosophy rooted in Platonic and Aristotelian thought in this new form. In the Islamic world, ancient philosophy became known through Ibn Sina, and later Muslim theologians engaged, debated, and critiqued his works. They formulated answers to theological questions that had been preserved and transformed by Ibn Sina's model. So, of course, we know that Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, in his Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosopher, he really deals like a death blow to this trend of what it's called peripatetic philosophy. Peripatetic means to walk, al-mashai'un in Arabic, because Aristotle was said to walk around his garden with his students. And Ibn Sina, Al-Farabi, Al-Kindi, etc., and other minor Muslim philosophers followed that kind of school of thought. Al-Ghazali points out that there are major incompatibilities with that on a metaphysical level. Not on a metaphysical level, on a high level, first principle level with Islam. This leads to the false notion that a lot of modern thinkers have that Islam as expressed in the likes of people like Imam al-Ghazali, traditional Sunniism is anti-intellectual, anti-rational. Well, that's not what it means at all. It just means that there were just some things that were incompatible. And the proof of that's a false notion is the fact that we're studying logic right now. But, I just want you to understand where it comes from. Okay, coming back to the introduction here. As philosophy was developed by Muslims following the foundations set by Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, and Ibn Sina, many of their ideas were challenged on a theological basis by Muslim thinkers who objected. Oh, subhanAllah, she's saying the same thing I just said. This is, by the way, the first time I read the introduction. I just flipped through it before I hit the recording. So this is a good tawfiq. Many of their ideas were challenged on a theological basis by Muslim thinkers who objected to some of their beliefs on creedal grounds. For instance, Al-Ghazali, who I just mentioned, argued that three beliefs held by the philosophers were antithetical to Islamic belief, meaning that they led to disbelief, kufr. Those he found objectionable were: one, the belief in the eternality of the universe, because nothing can be co-eternal with Allah. Only Allah is al-Qadim, which is the technical word for eternality. Number two, the idea that God does not interfere in the particulars of life, because this violates the text of the Quran, that nothing happens except that Allah knows it. إِلَّا فِي كِتَابٍ مُبِينٍ, Allah says. And number three, the idea of the resurrection of the soul, but not the body in the afterlife, because we have the sound hadith traditions that talk about us being resurrected. I mean, it's just foolish to argue against these three, to hold these three positions, because it's prima facie against the revelation itself. Before Al-Ghazali's time, Muslim thinkers who objected to some of the creedal matters that philosophers delved into lacked the intellectual tools to challenge these ideas. And Imam al-Ghazali, before he wrote Tahafut al-Falasifa, he wrote an excellent book called Maqasid al-Falasifa. And in that book, he lays out all of the arguments of the philosophers to prove that he understood their arguments. That book was translated into Latin before Tahafut al-Falasifa. So for many centuries, people in Europe thought that Imam al-Ghazali was a peripatetic philosopher. That's how well he knew the arguments. Thus, many of them objected either through polemical exchanges or through disengagement. Al-Ghazali saw, rahimahullah, that this approach did not adequately challenge what he deemed to be the problematic creedal elements of Islamic philosophy, and that rather than polemics or avoidance, Muslim thinkers needed to find a way to engage philosophy using the same form of rational intellectual tools of the philosophers. And that's our whole goal with the universities. We want to learn and we want to teach. We don't want to just be responding emotionally. So I'm just going to pause with a couple of commentaries because the time is running out. I won't be able to read the next paragraph. So even though the peripatetic philosophers had problems, there are still benefits from them, and one of them is what we're going to be talking about, which is logic, and we'll pick this up in the next and last clip, inshallah. Rather than closing the door of reason, as some contemporary scholars contended, Al-Ghazali in fact opened the doors for an engagement of philosophy by mainstream Sunni theologians. This alternative narrative, that is, the idea that the door of reason did not close, is now becoming more prevalent in the Western academy through works that demonstrate that Al-Ghazali did not contradict philosophy altogether in his famous work Incoherence of the Philosophers, Tahafut al-Falasifa. Rather, he used the rational methodology of engagement set by the philosophers themselves to demonstrate specific inconsistencies in some of their conclusions. This effort was later taken up by the Ash'ari Shafi'i scholar Fakhr ad-Din al-Razi, rahimahullah, who completed the path opened by Al-Ghazali by rewriting theological texts in a way that incorporates the theologically relevant philosophical questions, such as the nature of existence and the physical world, into these discussions. Al-Razi used philosophy, which he refers to as al-hikmah, which he includes in the text of theology, kalam, to further develop philosophical discussions and challenge many of the beliefs of earlier philosophers, belief that he and other Muslim scholars regarded as both rationally inconsistent and creedally flawed. And alhamdulillah, a huge effort now is coming to bring a lot of Al-Razi's works into critical Arabic editions, and many of them are actually very beautiful volumes, alhamdulillah. Of course, Al-Razi is a huge figure, Ghazali, but Al-Razi is also a huge figure for us because he's a major madhab of usul al-fiqh. He's a Shafi'i jurist, he's an Ash'ari theologian, mufassir of the Quran, so he's a massive figure for us specifically as Shafi'is. This new school of theology, based on Al-Razi's model of engaging philosophical problems through similar rational methods, included in philosophical texts became known as the post-classical or late mutaakhirun school of theology. So when we study theology, we have the mutaqaddimun, the earlier style of the Ash'ari madhab, and the mutaakhirun, those that are later, represented by the likes of al-Razi. This school, meaning the mutaakhirun, the post-classical school, this school stood in contrast to the model of the Ash'ari theology prior to al-Ghazali, known as the classical school of Ash'ariism al-Mutaqaddimun. Al-Abhari, of whose the main text and of which the Sulam is just a versification. Al-Abhari adopted the school of philosophical theology propagated by his teacher Fakhruddin al-Razi. His works on logic and philosophy follow al-Razi's structure and rationale that Sunni theologians must be able to engage philosophers and their methodologies to effectively respond to the challenges they were deemed to pose to the mainstream creed. This right here is the debate or where modern Salafism comes in, because they attack this approach of the late Ash'ari schools. She has a section here on Fakhruddin al-Razi and the Ottoman intellectual tradition. I'm assuming that she studied in Turkey and she's influenced by the Ottoman. It's in the interest of time. I can read it, inshallah. As mentioned, al-Razi built on al-Ghazali's foundation by resurrecting Ash'ari theology to substantially engage and incorporate the major questions examined by philosophers. He refrained from polemical discourse and utilized a level of rigor and rational debate that placed Ash'ari theology on an equal intellectual footing with philosophers in Ibn Sina's tradition. As a result, we can say that later Sunni theology and philosophy were transformed when Ash'ari theology was philosophized and Ibn Sina's philosophy was significantly reshaped under the framework of mainstream theological discourse. Al-Razi's school of thought became prevalent and influenced various centers of learning through the Ikhanid and Timurid era Iran and Transoxania, Ma Wara an-Nahr, before eventually becoming the foundation on which the Ottoman intellectual tradition of theology, philosophy, and Islamic law developed. Patronage of Islamic educational institutions and thinking during the Ottoman era led to the continued flourishing of the Ash'ari and Maturidi philosophical theology that many Ottoman theologians adhere to. In fact, we see a movement amongst theologians of this era to bring together the post-classical Ash'ari and later Maturidi schools. The expanse of Ottoman lands and the length of Ottoman dominance as a world power ensured that their endowed scholastic networks, which excelled in the rational science, al-aqliyat, cultivated the continued development of Islamic philosophy, logic, and theology, kalam, as foundational elements in Islamic education. In the Ottoman era, the establishment of al-Razi's model of rational discourse in philosophy debate, al-Bahth wal-Munazara, led to a new level of lively dialogue and exchange between Sunni and Shia thinkers based in the Ottoman and Safavid scholastical networks. As a result, a discourse with a more reconciliatory tone between Ottoman Sunni and Safavid Shia theologians emerged. Over time, substantial overlap and commonalities on matters related to philosophy and metaphysics led to discussion and debate between followers of these two streams of thought who engaged in rational discourse rather than polemics. Examples of these intellectual engagements can be seen in the many commentaries on the Shi'i scholar Nasr ad-Din Tusi's Tajrid al-Aqaid by prominent Sunni scholars such as Shamsuddin Mahmud ibn Abd al-Rahman al-Isfahani, who died in 749, and Sharif al-Jurjani, the famous Sharif al-Jurjani, who died in 816, whose works were later incorporated into the Ottoman educational system and elaborated on through the many commentaries on these commentaries. And by the way, these are the same works that they studied at Al-Azhar. She didn't include that, so it's not just the Ottoman period, but the Azhar tradition has that as well. Sunni commentaries on al-Tusi's discussions of metaphysics and philosophies became a bridge of constructive dialogue between Sunni and Shia thinkers during the Ottoman era, while Isfahani's debate with al-Tusi in his Tasdeed al-Qawa'id fi Sharh Tajrid al-Aqaid on religious and political leadership, Imama, became a foundational section on the text studied in the Ottoman madrasa curriculum and shaped a distinctive Sunni perspective on this topic. Meanwhile, a major criticism of al-Razi's Islamic philosophical theology arose amongst the segment of the Maghribi school of the Ash'ari theologians that included at-Tilmisani as-Sanusi, who were highly critical of this incorporation of philosophy into the books of theology. Sharaf ad-Din al-Masani, who died in 658, rahimahullah, was known for his sharp criticism of al-Razi's commentary on al-Razi's Ma'alim fi Usul ad-Din. That's the book that just came out, I think, in a critical edition. Another Maghribi theologian, Mahmud bin Yusuf as-Sanusi, who died in 890, rahimahullah, was known to have forbidden beginners from reading the texts of al-Baydawi, who died in 685, who followed the precedent set by al-Razi. While the Maghribi school maintained al-Juwayni's model of theology by preserving the school of the Mutaqaddimun, the early ones, Mutaqaddimin, the early Ash'aris, they were less influential than other learning centers because after the fall of the Andalus, Islamic scholastic institutions in this geographic region lost many of their patrons. At the same time, there was a shift in the geographical center of the Muslim intellectual developments from the prosperous economic centers of Nisapur, Samarkand, Bukhara, and Baghdad to the newly formed Ottoman Empire. After 600 years of power and the migration of Sunni scholars to its lands from the 9th century, Islamic century onwards, scholars based in Ottoman lands became prominent. Thus, various theologians, amongst them al-Baydawi, Al-Adud al-Iji, who died in 756, Al-Taftazani, Al-Sharaf al-Jurjani, Siraj al-Din al-Urmawi. They built on al-Razi's thinking by the late foundation of the post-classical school of Ash'ari theology. The school ensured that Muslim engagement with philosophy continued from the 8th century through the 12th century. Okay, a little bit more. I might have to go over. Porphyry and his Isarouj. Porphyry, who lived between 234 and 305 of the Common Era, known as Furfurius in Arabic sources, was born in a Phoenician family in the city of Tyre, later known as Sur in modern-day southern Lebanon. His name was Malchus, which means king in Semitic languages. It is said that he was given the name Porphyrius when he was in Athens. The word Porphyrius means the one who wears purple, and may have been an allusion to the purple color worn by royalty. Other accounts state that he was given the name Basilius, which is a Latinized version of his name that also means king, and that the name Porphyrius refers to the connection to Tyre, which is known as the city of purple. Porphyry traveled to Athens to study with Longinus, who lived from 213 to 273, and then later to Rome, where he became the foremost student of Plotinus, who died in 270. History later recognized Porphyry for his extensive works, recording the philosophy of his teacher Plotinus in the Enneads. 19th century historians consider Plotinus the founder of what they categorized as Neoplatonism, a philosophical movement that restored Plato's teachings, particularly his emphasis on the reality of forms in the metaphysical realm, in response to the Hellenic schools of Epicureanism and Stoicism, which evolved after Aristotle, whose focus on the corporeal was criticized for being superficial. In addition to recording the philosophy of Plotinus, Porphyry authored a number of texts, some of which are no longer extant, though others remain in part, such as the Life of Plotinus, the Life of Pythagoras, a letter to Marcella, and on abstinence from eating food from animals. One of the more well-known of these works was his Isarouj, a short treatise introducing Aristotle's 6 books known as the Organon, which we've talked about. Some maintain that the Isarouj was just an introduction to Aristotle's categories. Others argue that it is more likely that this work was designed to introduce beginners to the works of Aristotle, whose first work is in the categories. Okay, the last section is just 3 paragraphs, and I apologize for being too long. In the millennium between Porphyry's Isarouj and Al-Abhari's Isarouj, the genre of the Madkhal to logic evolved into a new form in its Islamic context. After Byzantium's conversion to Christianity in the 4th century, and because of the skepticism of many medieval Christian leaders, the study of philosophy was suppressed in ways that it had not been before. The works of Greek philosophers such as Aristotle were not limited to Byzantine lands, but also took root in the East. From the time of Alexander the Great, who sought to spread Hellenic education through its texts, these works spread through the gates of Babylon and the Central Asian regions of the Bactrians. Simply put, Al-Abhari's Isarouj is not a translation of Porphyry's Isarouj. Al-Abhari's inherited an intellectual lineage of philosophical scholarship that engaged with and transformed Greek philosophy into Islamic philosophical theology as discussed above. Although the Isarouj of Porphyry and that of Al-Abhari share a title, by Al-Abhari's time, Muslim philosophical theologians had significantly redefined words and concepts inherited from ancient philosophy and located them in their own text. Last paragraph. Thus, the similarity in title is incidental and does not indicate that one is a translation of the other. A preliminary examination of the contents of these two works makes this amply clear. Prophery's Isa Rouge is entirely dedicated to outlining the five predictables. That is the way in which things are classified. Prophery lists these five predictables as species, difference, genus, property, and accident. By contrast, Al-Abhari begins his Isa Rouge with a discussion of how we give meaning to objects. In fact, he spends relatively little time on the predicables. His treatise focuses on how to form propositions and make sound arguments. Thus, the common error of assuming that the Arabic Isa Rouge authored by Al-Abhari is the same as the Isa Rouge of Prophery is easily clarified by comparison of the context of each. In his Isa Rouge, Al-Abhari follows Ibn Sina's structure of outlining logic by defining sections into concepts, tasawurat, and essence, tasdiqat. This is a divergence from the Aristotelian organization of logic and demonstrates that Al-Abhari's thought evolved from the time of Prophery's work. A more detailed discussion of concepts and essence follows in the text. And that's it for today. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Okay, so this was a little unorthodox, this class, I apologize, but I found Ferial Salim's introduction to Al-Abhari's Isa Rouge that's published in this book by Blue Mountain Press. I don't even know if this is still available, but I got it a few years ago. I found it to be an excellent introduction that I wanted to do, so why reinvent the wheel? I'm very happy just to copy and read a very, very qualified introduction. So we read this introduction that gave us kind of a snapshot in history, of intellectual history, of where logic comes from in the Greek world, and how Aristotle is like, logic on steroids. It's like the Organon's this massive tome. It's like a book, 400 pages of very terse language. And there was a need a generation later to create an introduction to that, and that's what Prophery did with his Isa Rouge. However, Aristotelian thought, and Platonic thought for that matter, came into the Muslim world through translations by the time of the Abbasids. And when that stuff came, some Muslims, philosophers like Al-Kindi, Ibn Sina, and Al-Farabi, kind of delved into that, commented on, and synthesized that kind of from an Islamic perspective. But by the time we get to Imam al-Ghazali, we notice that there are some clear creedal theological problems and incompatibility with the peripatetic tradition and the normative Sunni tradition. So what ends up happening is we develop, after al-Ghazali, a new approach to Sunni theology, the later Ash'ari school, led by people like Fakhruddin al-Razi, in which we basically discard the things that don't work and we keep the things that work. And it was at that time that we get this introduction to logic that we're studying. So this is not a translation of Prophery's Isa Rouge, nor is it a translation of something that Aristotle wrote, but this is our understanding of how to think clearly using the scheme, as she says in the introduction, using the scheme laid down by Ibn Sina. So this is the kind of the idea of how we should approach logic. So we don't really need to do more of that kind of, it's fascinating. I find it fascinating, but there's a lot of references. We're not going to do that. Starting the next class, we're going to jump into the versification, the Sulam al-Munawraqi, and we're just going to read it line by line and comment on it, inshallah. And I'm sorry if you found it a little boring that I was reading, but it's such a good introduction. There's no reason for me to reinvent that. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.